So it is my pleasure to welcome our four speakers today. Rob Gegear is a professor of biology at UMass Dartmouth who has done extensive research on the conservation and evolution of native pollination systems. He also founded the Beecology Project, which uses citizen-collected data to study plant-pollinator interactions. Dr. Gegear's research on at-risk pollinators and their preferred host plants is being widely used to design and create pollinator habitat in the Northeast and in Massachusetts specifically, and that includes habitat projects that are part of the Lincoln Action Pollinator Plan, which you'll be hearing about today. Evan Abramson is founder and principal at Landscape Interactions, an ecological regional planning and landscape design enterprise responsible for installing nearly 300 acres of habitat in the Northeast since 2019, specifically targeting the needs of at-risk bee and butterfly species. Evan is a graduate of the Conway School of Landscape Design and
Rosemary, you muted yourself accidentally just now.
Oh, was I muted?
Yes.
Oh, I'm muted now?
Just for a moment, you're good now.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, okay. Did we all hear Evan's introduction? Yes? Okay. In case I was muted at the end there, I just wanted to restate that Evan is the designer of the Lincoln Pollinator Action Plan, which we'll be hearing about today. Bryn Gingrich is the outreach director at the Lincoln Land Conservation Trust, where she leads their outreach work, including annual programming and community engagement. Sara Lupkas is the stewardship director at Lincoln Land Conservation Trust. She's responsible for managing fee-owned conservation land, as well as monitoring conservation restrictions, trail management, and habitat health, including invasive plant management. Bryn and Sara work together to implement the plans for Lincoln's pollinator corridor. So all of these folks, from sort of the science all the way to designing and then implementing, are involved in the Lincoln Pollinator Action Plan. I'm very excited for them to demonstrate how all of these pieces fit together. So thank you so much for being here. Rob, please take it away.
Okay, Rosemary, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. So my talk today is going to focus on goals and what we need to do to meet those goals. And this is, an extremely important part. Clearly, defining your goal is an extremely important part of any project. If your goal is to get a bunch of animals visiting flowers in your backyard or on a conservation land, you can pretty much plant anything that has nectar and you'll reach your goal. If your goal is focused on conservation, so you're trying to help something, there's a very specific set of things that you need to do, that you need to consider. And so before I get into our specific goal and what we need to consider, I'm going to start by giving you some background. So, when it comes to pollinators, pollination systems, it's extremely important that you understand the biology and really understand and make it clear what you're trying to do. So a wide variety of animals visit flowers to feed on the nectar and pollen. About 200,000 of these species globally, only 1,000 of which are vertebrates. So the vast majority of what we see visiting flowers are insects. This includes the bees, get a lot of attention, but there are also butterflies, moths, flies, and beetles are all out there visiting flowers. And if we switch things now to the plant's perspective, if these animals, while they're visiting flowers and foraging, transfer pollen, leading to fertilization, the production of seeds and fruit, their name changes from flower visitor to pollinator. And if you look at the background here, we can see that there are a lot of plant species in bloom, and each one of these plant species is targeting a subset of those flower visiting animals for pollination. And so if we look at who the plants are targeting, each plant species is targeting a different subset. Some are targeting small-bodied bees, some may target large-bodied bees, some may target long-tongued animals, so long-tongued bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds. Some may specifically target hummingbirds, like the plant species shown here. Some may target flies for pollination. And these systems may be highly specialized. So here we have one fly species and one plant species. Without the plant, the fly dies, and without the flies decline, and without the flies, that the plants would decline. And some are targeting butterflies. And so the plant and the collection of all of its pollinators, we refer to as a pollination system. And hopefully you can see here that when we use the term pollinator, we really need to consider, it's all about the plant. That plant that the animal's pollinating is that you can think of the plant and the animal as a unit. And the reason why this is so important is because that relationship between the animal and the plant, so the plant and its pollinators, that diversity that we see, we can think of it as providing the foundation for ecosystems. So the pollination products, so seeds and fruit produced through a pollination event, the plant material is providing food for other trophic levels. So the seeds and fruit may be for, supporting small mammals and birds, which are in turn supporting predatory birds. Now, we can think of each plant species as providing a unique type of food. So each system is providing a unique type of food. And if we start to remove some of these components, we're going to start to see cascading effects on these other species. And what happens then, if we start to remove our foundation, we're going to get what's called ecosystem collapse, a massive reduction in biodiversity. And the reason that this is so important to us is because we rely on what are called ecosystem services. These are things we get from healthy, functional ecosystems for free. So carbon sequestration, soil decomposition, recreation, all of these things depend on this diversity. And so we want to keep that intact. So to give you an example then of what we mean by supporting biodiversity or biodiversity that is generated through pollination systems. Here we have hummingbird visiting Monarda. The pollination event could lead to the production of seeds that are feeding our purple finch. And then the Monarda plant itself is a host plant for the orange mint moth. The larval stage may be eaten by other birds. So we can see how everything's connected with this native plant as the hub. All of these have co-evolved with that native plant to create the biodiversity and create the system. Now, if we look at removing the animal from that system, here we have our hummingbirds visiting a feeder. We've got tons of hummingbirds where if they're well fed, we can keep our hummingbird populations going, but we've lost the functional importance of those hummingbirds as pollinators, and we're going to lose all of these species in the process. Similarly, if we swap our native plant with a non-native plant, we may get pollination, production of seeds and fruit, but our purple finch don't want it, they won't eat seeds from the European honeysuckle. And so we're removing food items from our purple finch. And so it's very important that we focus then on the connections between or among these native species. The problem is these native systems are in a state of decline. So plant pollinator systems in general are declining globally. In Massachusetts, we're seeing declines both from the animal side of the equation, the plant side of the equation. So here we have some data that I collected on bumblebees, published data on butterflies, many species declining, and not surprisingly, our animal pollinated plants, native plants are also in decline. And not surprisingly, the plant species that are in decline, like our Penstemon hirsutus, are pollinated by the bees that are in decline. And so, you know, most people are aware of pollinator decline. Many aren't aware that not everything is in decline. So when we look at these graphs, we see, yes, there are some species that are headed in the direction of local extinction. Others are doing better than they've done historically, like two bumblebee species, we see butterflies and even native plants. So the key here is that when we start to think about goals and conservation, we're targeting a subset of species. We can't just say, hey, this is a great bumblebee plant. We need to say, okay, this plant is supporting this specific species, or we're trying to help this specific species, because if we see we have to get away from this one size fits all approach. And so then the goal is, how are we going to restore these systems, either from the animal side or the plant side, or both, and also the connections with the wildlife. And because not surprisingly, a lot of the wildlife, like birds in decline, are feeding on the seeds of the plants that are in decline. And so to understand what we need to do, we have to understand what these species actually need. So what is it that we're going to plant? And you know, it's surprising to me that there are a lot of plant lists out there. And if you look at what's actually visiting those plants, it's not the species that need it. It's this common species that actually don't need our help. And so what I try to do is collect data on the species that actually need our help and figure out how that differs from the common species, and then try to get those plants back in the system. And if the plants are in decline, to get those plants back into the system. So to figure these things out, I collect a lot of data. this is Breakneck Hill in Southborough, 40 acres. And basically I every week go out and record interactions between bees and flowers, interactions between butterflies and flowers. I have a grad student working on that now, and also trying to understand who the major pollinators are of plant species in decline. So collecting all the data, compiling the data, and what I found, not surprisingly, is that the species that are in trouble have very specific needs. A lot of in the case of bumblebees shown here, bumblebees have different tongue lengths, and long-tongued bees are matched up with tubular flowers. That's the system. And so we see that there are two species that are in trouble, and so that pollination system, so plants that depend on these bees are in trouble, and the wildlife would also be at risk. Other species like Bombus terricola, which is higher elevations in Western Mass, is all over milkweed. So here are data from just 1 month. All of these bees are in the same place at the same time with the same access to resource, yet they're doing things that are very different. If we look at butterflies, so as I mentioned, I have a grad student, Annie Monroe, that's working on this, collecting data on butterflies. We know the butterfly species in decline. We know the host plants. The nectar preferences aren't known as well. And when we look at some data from last summer, so this is from 2021, we see that some species like Monarda, which is feeding our at-risk bumblebees, is also supporting 5 species of butterfly species of conservation concern. And our Prunella vulgaris is supporting 3 species of conservation concern in addition to the bee species. So we have these high conservation value native plants that we can put in. We can start to work this into the system. Non-bombus bees, so they're, bumblebees are just a small portion of all the bees that we have. We look at the bee species in decline. We look at the plants. So this, if they're generalists, we need to start to look at when these species are actually active. So some of these bees are finished by June. If we're starting to plant in July, we're going to miss these species completely. So we have to really think about the species that need it when they're active and what they might need in terms of nectar and pollen. And so I've compiled data from all of these groups. The bumblebees I collected myself, butterflies we're starting, and other bees, looking at the primary literature. And I've compiled a plant list that we use that could be used as a reference to figure out what to put in. And so once with these data in hand, the next part of it is then, okay, what are we going to do how are we going to translate this data into conservation action? And so here it's very specific to whatever the habitat is. Each habitat, each landscape is going to differ. And so the steps that we follow, that I follow, first of all, we'll go in and assess what is actually there in terms of the plants and the animal species at risk. Once we have information, so that means surveying for an extended period of time to get baseline data. I then make recommendations that Evan will talk about, and implementation that Evan, Bryn, and Sara will also talk about, that part of the process. And then I go in and I'll reassess to quantify the change. Did our change make a difference? That is very important to me. The other thing that's important to me is that the educational component, that I want to empower everybody that's associated with that landscape so that they can ID the species that are in trouble, they can ID the plants, and they can see the change themselves. Because once they see the change, and this is happening at other sites throughout the state that I've established, that really motivates, and people start to make those changes themselves in their own backyards, and things start to grow, and we really get we really accelerate conservation effort for these at-risk systems. So in the case of Lincoln, I went in, there were 2 sites that I surveyed intensively, Browning Fields and People for Pollinators. Browning Fields, it's all this area, wet meadow. There's some old field here. People for Pollinators, so this was planted with native plants. And this box down here, the rest of this is old field and isn't actively managed to any degree. And so I went in and surveyed, and so I get a sense of what species are there. So here are the bumblebee species that are there. We see, this is good news, that we see 2 of this target species, Bombus vagans and Bombus fervidus, are at both sites. Much more abundant at People for Pollinators. But what I want to point out here is, and I cut off this bar, this should be up to 500, that Bombus impatiens, this is the common eastern bumblebee, and it's extremely abundant. And so this is highlighting the difference between abundance and diversity. We can't just see a bunch of bumblebees and think we're doing our job. We really need to understand and or or look closer and look to see if we have the species that are at risk. What are those species visiting? So we get a sense of the plants, the host plants that they're using. We see, again, there's a very big difference. Bombus impatiens is all over goldenrod and Joe pieweed, in the hundreds. But we look at our target species, they're focused on red clover and prunella. When we look at people for pollinators, where they actually actively planted some native plants, we see the numbers are much higher, and they are favoring wild bergamot, so monardas, and also you see them to some extent on red clover. If we didn't see monarda, they would all be all over the red clover, and they would be at the same level that they are at Browning Field. The dependence is so strong. So remember, we've got 9 acres. They're only on red clover and prunella, and the amount of red clover and prunella is extremely small. They mowed the red clover and prunella, and guess what happened? No Bombus vagans and no Bombus fervidus for the rest of the summer. That's how dependent these bees are on these plant species. The monarda wasn't mowed, thankfully, and the colonies are allowed to grow, more reproductives, and I think that's why we see larger populations at people for pollinators. But we can see here, if we were to transfer some of these plants over to Browning Field, then we would be able to support these species. Okay, so with those recommendations then, seeing what's there, seeing what they could do, I generate a plant list and pass it along to Evan for the design, and then it goes to Bryn and Sara for implementation. And I'm still waiting to reassess, but I can say confidently, based on the other habitats I put in after reassessment, that these changes have a positive impact. But again, we'll see once these habitats get established. And with that, I'd like to thank you, and I'll pass things over to Evan.
Thank you, Dr. Gegear.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Rob. That was really great. I feel like every time I hear you speak, it's just, I always grab a whole new library of information. So hopefully you can all see my screen here now, and I'll get started talking about, let's see here, the Lincoln Pollinator Action Plan. So as Rob mentioned, this project is a collaboration between the Lincoln Land Conservation Trust, Landscape Interactions, my company, and the UMass Dartmouth Gegear lab, which Rob runs with his graduate students. And essentially the Lincoln Pollinator Action Plan, it first came about, the idea came about 3 years ago when Rob and I presented at the Mass Land Conference in 2019. And we met Jane Ruba Chevalier, who was the former Special Projects Director for the Lincoln Land Conservation Trust. And she reached out to us as to whether we'd be interested in creating a corridor for pollinator habitat and biodiversity restoration across the town of Lincoln. And we were very enthusiastic. And so this project is the result of that initial meeting at the same conference. The plan starts out talking about why pollinator habitat restoration is so crucial nowadays. So I'm going to take you guys on a little summary of the plan. We're living in a time that has never before been seen on the planet. Humans have impacted the Earth to such an extent that we're now living in a new geological epoch, which is called the age of the Anthropocene. And it's essentially defined by the global mass extinction of species, as well as the transformation of land by deforestation and development, and carbon and sea level rise. And right now, as many as 30 to 50% of all species on the planet are heading towards extinction. This essentially means that we're facing a potential collapse of nature, because insects are essential for all ecosystems, not only as pollinators, but as food for other creatures and recyclers of nutrients. More than half of the native bee species in North America are threatened with extinction, as well as 1 million species globally. And the big #1 reason for that is loss of natural habitat. That is what we are trying to address with the Lincoln Pollinator Action Plan. We're trying to restore natural habitat features for native pollinators, native plants, and all of the animals that depend upon them throughout the food web, as you can see here in this illustration. I firmly and strongly believe that our best opportunities for turning around the global biodiversity crisis is by doing the kinds of projects that we're doing in Lincoln and in other towns. Farms, conservation properties, urban and suburban communities, solar fields. These are our opportunities for restoring regional biodiversity by creating robust, diverse native pollination systems, plants and the pollinators that visit them, and all the animals that benefit. And not only is this important for biodiversity, it's also essential for responding to climate change, because ecological resilience is the most important attribute for any natural system to respond to disturbance, such as flooding, wildfire, drought, invasive species, and so on. So the more diverse the landscape is, the better a chance it has of bouncing back. You don't want it to be depending upon one plant species or one animal species to be doing all of the work in that ecosystem. So Rob talked a lot about this already. I'm going to zip through this, but essentially pollinators are keystone species. They assist over 80% of the world's flowering plants. And in Massachusetts, nearly half of our food crops are bee pollinated. And their pollinators are essential for creating and maintaining habitats and ecosystems that most animals rely upon for food and shelter, including humans. So looking at the town of Lincoln, these here are a few of our sites that Rob touched upon. We have Upper Browning Fields down here in the bottom right, Chapman Pasture, and People Per Pollinators. These are 3 of our 4 case study sites. And these are the 3 sites that Rob is studying over a 3-year period to demonstrate the before and after impact of the project on pollinator species diversity. These here are 3 residential sites where the homeowners have planted plants that were recommended in the Lincoln Pollinator Action Plan. And you can see here the average flight distance of different native bee groups: bumblebees in yellow, mason bees in blue, and sweat bees in pink. These just represent a few among many. But the idea is that if you want to create a corridor across a town, across a neighborhood or a city or even a county, you have to really have sites located pretty close together if you want to get the overlap of species visiting one site and then going to another. And that's what we're trying to do in Lincoln. This entire project is informed by scientific research. It is arguably the only massive regional plan involving scientific research informing the actions that the community is taking on the ground. Rob is studying these sites over a 3-year period. His research informed the plants that we recommended and the designs that we created for the plan. And this here is a picture of Rob giving a workshop in 2020 and how people in Lincoln can use an app that he created called Bee Ecology to film and photograph bumblebees out in the field so that we can get better data. And you can do that no matter where you live. You can download it at this link over here. It's beecology.wpi.edu. And please, feel free to check it out and start contributing to data collection. As Rob mentioned, we're looking at sites in Lincoln over a 3-year period to show the before and after differences. And as a result of the outreach work that the Lincoln Land Conservation Trust has been doing since the project began in late 2019, I believe nearly 2,000 plants were installed in Lincoln in the first year before the plan was even published, representing about, I think, 12 different towns planted, and they sold nearly 100 planting kits. And these planting kits are essentially smaller versions of the designs that are in the plan. So we're getting people to put in the right things. This here on the left is a map of the town of Lincoln. And you can see here in darker purple, these are our 4 design sites in the town. And 3 of them are being studied over a 3-year period, these 3 at the bottom. This one up here is the Birches School. And then over all the properties that are in lighter purple, these are residential or privately owned properties in Lincoln that purchase the planting kits from the land trust. So, the subject of today's talk is land trusts as partners in pollinator corridors. And I really think that, if anything, it's the most important component to have the land trust as a partner, because they're the ones informing the public and offering them the opportunity to not only learn about the plan, but also buy the plants that the plan recommends. So essentially, without Bryn and Sara and Jeff and others at the land trust doing the outreach, this plan would be going nowhere. It would just be sitting on a shelf collecting dust. But because of the outreach that's been done, all of these properties already have the right plants on their sites. And this is all 2020 data. This is before the plan was even published early last year. So you can see here with a 500-foot buffer on each property, which represents the average range that a native bee might go from its nest, look at all the overlap between the sites. And I mean, I would imagine that there's probably dozens more sites that have habitat installed now, because this map was created based on data from a year and a half ago. This here is the list of pollinators that are being targeted by the plan and are supported by the project. So we're targeting 4 at-risk bumblebee species and about 15 at-risk butterfly species. And again, we're about to enter the second season of, well, the third season of data collection, but probably the second season of changes, because some of these sites have just been installed last year. So each of the sites, not only is it being studied over a 3-year period, but it has a site-specific toolkit. And the toolkit is like a term that we use at Landscape Interactions. For us, it means it's a site-specific design for that property with a site establishment, management, and maintenance plan, as well as a custom plant list and, if necessary, seed mixes. So like I said, in Lincoln, we've got 4 toolkit sites, 3 are being studied, and each of them has their own version of how to do this habitat, depending upon what the property looks like. We're drawing from this list of plants. This list of plants is for Lincoln as a whole. It also is for northeastern Massachusetts as a whole. And if any of you, want to be able to download this, we'll provide the link in the chat. You can get it from our website or from the Land Trust website. So our 4 toolkit sites in Lincoln, what we did for that was we looked at the whole town and we viewed about 11 or 12 properties in late 2019 that the Land Trust was considering for the project. And we honed down those initial 11 or 12 properties to 4 sites. The reason why we picked these 4 sites is because they represent the widest possible range of landscapes. So Lincoln is a town that is close to Boston, about 40 minutes west, but it's still somewhat rural. It's got a lot of permanently protected conservation property and old fields and old farm fields. It's also got a lot of wetlands. And then it also has a lot of developed areas, where people have their homes in the town. So what we chose was 4 sites that represent these listed landscape conditions. Meadow and Woodland Edge, that is the People for Pollinators site. Old Field is the Chapman pasture. It's an old sheep pasture. Wet Meadow is Upper Browning Fields. And then we have a garden and lawn site, which is the Burgess School. So now I'll take you through each of those toolkit sites so you can see how they work and how we replicate them across the town. So the Meadow and Woodland Toolkit is for the People for Pollinators site. It's, you can see the map over here on the top right. It is a mix of forest, shrubland, and forested wetland, and then it's adjacent to a larger property that's an old field. And essentially, the Land Trust had been stewarding part of the site since, I think, 2016. They had this fenced-in area, which you can see here at the bottom, which had been planted with a meadow back in 2016. And so we went in and we saw the opportunities there as well as what was missing. And we created this design. So what this design does is it takes the existing meadow that's inside the fence, and it recommends about a third of it was had been growing in with non-native grasses and weeds. So what we recommended was just going into the fence, pulling out all those areas that were not native plant communities, and reseeding them with a custom seed mix that we created. Additionally, we created this design that included a mix of mowed paths, a shed with rain barrels for collecting water because this site doesn't have running water for watering, There's nesting habitat for ground nesting bees, like most bumblebees, as well as a mix of shrubs, trees, native flowers, sedges, and native bunching grasses. And then we've got this site-specific plant list. So a few of the plants that we're using here on this site, as well as on other sites in Lincoln, are native willows. So we've got on this site pussy willow, prairie willow, shining willow, and meadow willow. We have scrub oak. That's an important host plant for a lot of at-risk butterflies, as well as moths. Eastern redbud, Atlantic white cedar, another host plant for at-risk butterfly. And then we've got a bunch of shrubs, including button bush, northern bush honeysuckle, shrubby St. John's wort, native roses, native raspberries, blackberries, meadowsweet, steeplebush, native cranberry, native blueberry, and then the native grasses, big blue stem, little blue stem, switchgrass, river oats, native sedges. We use Pennsylvania sedge for this site, native thistle, Joe pieweed, another St. John's wort, Canadian wood betony, Prunella vulgaris, dock, violet. And essentially, when all of this is, fully implemented, this site should attract and sustain most of the at-risk species that are our target species for the project. Here at the old field site, Chapman Pasture, this is an 8-acre site that at the beginning of the project was dominated by mostly non-native grasses. It had been grazed with sheep for about 40 years. And so after looking at the site a few times and meeting with the land trust and other partners, we determined that the best way to get the site ready for restoration for native species would be to burn it. And so we helped the land trust work on a grant to get funding from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Partners Program, and they received a grant and they were able to burn it last year. Once the site is burned, it's going to be burned a second time this year because some of the grasses came back again a little strong. It's going to be seeded with an upland mix in these areas in yellow and a wet mix in this wet swale area in the eastern side of the site. And then we have a site-specific plant list for planting, not only in the wetter areas in the swale, but also in the drier areas around rock outcroppings that are in the field. As the management plan, as I mentioned, calls for a burn followed by seed drilling using a no-till seed drill. We recommended the Truax Flex because it's the best for native seeds, which are very different from seeding, crops or grains. And we had our nesting strip detail here at the bottom. So to create a nesting strip for ground nesting bees, we recommend that on every site. Based on Dr. Gegear's research, we're recommending digging down 4 inches, removing all the soil and vegetation, and replacing that with a mix of sand and loam. So you can reuse the same topsoil mixed with sand and maybe a little gravel, and then planting native sedges and grasses nearby. And this here is our seed mix for the upland portion of the site, as well as the wet meadow portion of the site. And all of this is available on in the Lincoln Pollinator Action Plan, which you can download. And one of the most important things about establishing a meadow on a scale like this is really following the right mowing plan. So after the site is burned this year for the second time, what we're recommending is that the land trust is going to seed a spring-summer cover crop just to hold the soil in place and try to prevent non-native plants from coming back in. So they'll seed field oats. And then in the fall, they'll mow that down and they'll drill in these seed mixes with a winter cover crop. And then for the first 2 years, they'll mow the site with a brush hog. Anytime the vegetation gets to be about 10 or 12 inches, they'll knock it down to about 5 to 8 inches. And as long as you're keeping the vegetation no higher than 12, no lower than 5 or 6, you're going to allow those native plants to germinate, to get enough light, to start growing, and eventually to grow taller than the non-native grasses, which dominate. This here is an image of the Chapman Pasture site after last year's burn. And you can see the fire trucks here. This was a plan that had to be approved by the fire department as well as DEP, and was executed by a mix of local and regional professionals. The wet meadow site in Browning Field, essentially what we recommended based on Rob's observations was to limit mowing in the wet meadow area, and then to do some planting along the trail, which is marked here in a dashed green line, as well as to refrain from mowing key areas near the front where Bombus fervidus had been found having a lot of activity on the red clover and prunella. So this site was a little bit different. It's owned by the Conservation Commission. So we have to work in partnership with the town government in a sense to do that, or the town staff. So implementation has been going at a different pace, but this is less of a high cost project, so to speak, because it's really just changing mowing practices and changing ways of dealing with invasive species. So this site, sorry, I'm gonna go back just for a sec. The Browning Field site has a lot of glossy buckthorn. The glossy buckthorn is mostly growing around the perimeter of the wet meadow area, and I would say the first 20 to 50 feet inwards from where the pink starts. So the town conservation staff has been brush hogging usually mid-September to knock back the buckthorn, but that actually increases further growth. So what we recommended in the plan was to spot burn it using backpack propane torches. That we found was the most effective treatment without using herbicides, because they don't use herbicides on any of their properties. And we feel that if the town can get behind that and stop brush hogging these areas, we'll actually do a lot just by doing that, because there are a lot of native plant communities. This site already has buttonbush, it has swamp milkweed, it's got the spirea, it's got the Joe Pye weed, it's got different goldenrods, different native sedges, it's even got native loosestrife. So a lot of the plants that are on our plant list for Lincoln are on this site, even Canadian wood betony, Prunella vulgaris, and high bush and low bush blueberry. So a lot can be done by changing practices without even planting or buying anything. Just briefly, the last site, the Garden and Lawn Toolkit for the Birches School, this site is not going to be studied for a 3-year period, but what's great is that it was a huge community outreach. About 160 people came out for planting. The site looked like this at the beginning of the project, mostly mulch, not a lot of plants. And we created this design up here on the top right. This is a representation of what it would look like when it's fully grown in. And parents and students and volunteers came in and installed most of the design in late 2020. And this here is just a view of the site, the school's design. So it had 7 different areas representing different strategies for pollinators on a school or residential scale, including lawn conversion. So just really briefly, there's my timer giving me my 20-minute signal, so I'll move really quickly. But each of these toolkits represents a different way of doing things, so to speak. So we did a map of the town looking at all these properties in yellow would be properties suitable for replication of the school or the People for Pollinators design site based on their types of landscape and their size. Here in the middle are the opportunities for replication of the old field design on Chapman Pasture, and here on the right, the Upper Browning Fields Wet Meadow Toolkit. So some sites can do more than one of these toolkits. There's even a few that can do all 3, and that's because properties may contain various different features on them. They might have wetlands, they might also have open field, and they might also have residential or developed areas near a house or a building. So these maps are just really just sort of the beginning step in figuring out what you can do and which toolkit best suits you. And then we made a map showing if just the properties within 500 feet of one of the existing sites that already had habitat installed one of the toolkits, we would have this much connectivity across the town. So Bryn and Sara will talk to you about how the implementation and follow through has been going. These are just a few pictures of some of the sites being installed last year. We're studying the sites over a 3-year period, as I mentioned, to show the before and after differences. Please download the Beecology app if you're interested in submitting data across the state or across the region, and you can contact me at landscapeinteractions.com.
Thank you, Evan.
All right, everyone see that okay? Thank you, Evan. Hi, everyone. I'm Bryn Gingrich, and I'm the Outreach Director at the Lincoln Land Conservation Trust, and I'm here today with my colleague.
Hi, I'm Sara Lupkas. I'm the Stewardship Director.
And we wanted to just share today some photos and some stories from our experiences over the past couple of years as we've worked to implement the Lincoln Pollinator Action Plan. And I just can't emphasize enough how great a connection this project has been between our community outreach work and our land management and land stewardship work. So I'd like to just start diving right in with our pollinator plant sales. So in 2020, the Pollinator Action Plan had just been published, and we were excited to start ordering plants to put into the ground. And we asked ourselves, well, why don't we also take this opportunity to offer these plants to our community members? So we reached out to several nurseries and were able to get some great bulk purchasing prices. And you can see here, this was our sale last year, all of our perennials and grasses laid out. So in 2020, we offered a native shrub kit to Land Trust members. All of the plants that we offered were also on the Pollinator Action Plan and were going to be installed on conservation land. We organized the sale into kits that included 9 shrubs and were priced at about $100. And we ended up selling 59 kits, or a total of 800 shrubs, as well as some willow cuttings. This was the height of the pandemic, so you can see us masked and social distanced, and we offered a contactless drive-through pickup process. And thanks to the Lincoln Parks and Rec Department, we were able to store and distribute the plants from the school tennis courts and parking lot there. Also, I'm going to move quickly and not go into the specific plant lists and nurseries, but I'm happy to share that information after, and it's also available on our website. So here, this was our summer sale, which was actually, we took orders all at the same time, but not all of the plants were available in early spring for pickup. So we had a second distribution day. And for this distribution, we were handing out another 39 kits. Each had 21 plants with 3 of each perennial species, also priced around $100. And in total, that was another 1,000 plants entering the local landscape. You can see here, this is our organizing of all the plugs into boxes with the order slips on them. So this is, Evan also showed a nice map showing sort of the distribution of plants on the landscape now. About 75 Land Trust members participated in the sale. We did keep this as a membership benefit to encourage folks to stay, get involved and stay involved with our pollinator work. And we saw a lot of new members joining. And the bump in the membership also helped us cover some of the costs, not all, but some of the costs of purchasing the plants for conservation land. About 70% of these participants were Lincoln residents, but as Evan mentioned, we also had many, many other Massachusetts towns represented, which I think is great because it's showing this core of Lincoln and then the pollinator pathways expanding from there. I did want to mention, the decision process behind offering plant kits. They're really well received. It's an easy one-step ordering. We curated the kits to include a robust set of plants that bloom throughout the season and are represented on Dr. Gegear's plant list and in Evan's Pollinator Action Plan. So folks buying a kit really knew they were going to be putting in a robust pollinator garden. However, we wanted to make sure this sale was inclusive for folks who don't have the space or financial ability to purchase a whole kit. For example, in this picture on the left here, this is a home as part of a condominium, and they had just a small area where they're allowed to plant. So they purchased just a few shrubs. And you can imagine that if all of those neighbors in that condo association each planted just a few shrubs, eventually you would have this really amazing functional pollinator habitat. So to that end, we did offer the kits, but we also offered all of our plants a la carte as well. And you can also see here in the top right, these were the willow cuttings we purchased. We only offered these a la carte because they were a little bit more advanced in terms of the planting instructions. So we wanted to make sure that people who were buying them were willing to baby them for a couple months. Here's a couple pictures of our pollinator pathway signs. I was just blown away by the reception to these, and I'm thrilled every time I see them as drive through town. And we continue to offer these with our pollinator plant kits. So here is our 2021 pollinator plant sale. We offered both shrubs and perennials in May. And this year we, to simplify our inventory system, we offered all the plants a la carte. And this also allowed us to offer a few more plants that like wetter sites that we know wouldn't be a popular choice for most gardens in Lincoln. We sold over 1,400 perennials and more than 550 shrubs, and we had 150 members participate. It was really heartening to see, you know, this strong continued interest in our pollinator work. And again, the majority of participants were from Lincoln, but we saw a lot of familiar faces from nearby towns. You can see here volunteers loading up plants into people's vehicles. And we had laid out all of the orders the day before so that it was easy for folks to just swing by and pick up. I'd like to mention just quickly a few community partners that we have. In 2021, we worked with the Great American Rain Barrel Company to offer wholesale price rain barrels. You can see here on the right, our summer interns were thrilled to have the task of loading up the rain barrels, seeing as many as they could get on the truck to move it around the site to prep our orders. We also were able to engage with the Lincoln Water Department to offer some water conservation resources as part of that sale. And then on the left here, we have a delivery of garden carts from the Lincoln Garden Club. They had just hosted their own plant sale and were happy to loan their carts for the day so that we could more easily move plants around. And then lastly, I just want to thank our town DPW who let us host the sale on their site. We had 2 days in which we were taking plant deliveries and organizing the pickups. So I'm going to turn the mic over to you, Sara.
Thank you, Bryn. The Pollinator Action Plan, as Bryn mentioned, has been a really great initiative to collaborate on with regards to our outreach and stewardship goals. As stewardship director, my focus is on managing our lands, and this initiative has been a useful way to both focus our efforts and provide a framework for prioritization. We have a few conservation areas, as you saw, that were selected by Dr. Gegear, and then Evan developed the toolkits, and I can just talk a little bit about what it took to implement them, and it's an ongoing process. So we have an area behind our school campus, the People for Pollinators Meadow, and as Evan mentioned, Jane Gruber-Chevalier is a former staff member at LLCT, and now she's the executive director at Concord Land Conservation Trust, and she was really instrumental in getting this all started. A really nice thing about this site is its visibility. You can't see it from a road or a parking area, but it is behind our school campuses, and there is a great deal of available free parking usually, and it's at the entrance to a number of very popular walking trails. So we frequently get school groups, scouting troops, people just walking through on their way to walk or hike or run with friends and bring their dogs. And so it's really a well-loved area for our community. So we always have people passing by who are interested in what we're doing. And as part of Evan's design, we've been working to enhance the composition of plants. I'll just speak a tiny bit. I did see a question in the chat about why there's a fence. The fence was originally put in because of deer pressure in the area. And as we've seen, it still is very protective of all of our plants inside the fenced area. So eventually it's our goal to take it down, but for now, as we have very new plants, it would just not be manageable to protect them from all the deer without that fence. And as you can see on the left, one of the most challenging aspects to all of this planting is to clear the existing vegetation. So I am using a sod cutter there to clear the grass, and the plant lab is a collection of plants that Dr. Gegear supplied to us 2 years ago in 2020. So we cleared the sod, put in those plants. That was shortly after they were planted in the first growing season. And you can see in the back, we had a makeshift tent that we put together to try to funnel some water that would be caught on the roof into our rain barrels. So usually at the beginning of the season, we would fill up the rain barrels, but the tent actually did help to capture some water that we could use for watering the plants. Next slide, please. These are a few shots of the plant lab after a year, and you can see how well it's grown in and how lush the flowers have become. And then we planted some willows and shrubs around the fenced area in the summer of 2020. And then in the spring of 2021, we added many more plants, almost 100 shrubs. These action shots are from our local high school seniors on their day of service. We had some come out and help us with the planting. And just a few months later, you can see that they have filled in, and the blossoms are really gorgeous, and it was just really amazing to see. In the fall of 2021, we removed sod from inside the fenced area and planted plugs, and then planted 25 willows outside of the fenced area. One drawback to planting outside was that we did have to be very careful with deer pressure. So I sprayed the plants with a solution of plant skid, which definitely helped reduce the damage, but it does need to be reapplied every few weeks. And you have to time it right so it's not washed away by any rain. An extremely important part of the design, which we're in the process of building, is the shed. It'll actually be a pavilion because it will be open air. And by having a structure with a permanent roof, we'll not only create a shady area for visitors and our workers to relax in, but then we will have true gutters to direct the rainwater into our 4 rain barrels. And we plan to install solar panels to power a pump to pump the water. I will let Bryn speak about our next site, which is the Birches School.
Thanks, Sarah. So I think Evan showed a few slides earlier of the Birches School plan and planting day. I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Jane Gruber-Chevalier, who took the lead in sourcing the plants and organizing that community planting day. And you can see here, we had students, their families, and volunteers from the community who came out to transform their campus in the spring of 2020. And I think this really not only improves the look and the feel of the school grounds, but it's going to be a really great educational tool for future classes to be able to learn about pollination systems and really go and directly make those observations. And Jane is continuing to actively recruit and organize volunteers in the school community to help maintain the garden. So I can't wait to see how it looks. It'll be its 3rd growing season, I think, this coming spring.
So Chapman is really one of our biggest project sites, mainly because of the scale. As Evan mentioned, it is 8 acres, and also that non-native vegetation is just so entrenched due to its being used as a sheep pasture for over 40 years. And it also is important because it's surrounded by other conservation areas, which together form over 95 acres of protected land. Most of it is owned by LLCT, but as you saw Evan mention, it is adjacent to Brownings, which is owned by our town conservation commission. And so Evan mentioned the prescribed burn, and we are actually just getting ready to have our second prescribed burn, which might possibly be this week. It's always dependent on acquiring the funding and waiting for an appropriate weather window, but it hopefully will be this week. So we actually have been working on making sure that the field is well prepped and that we have the cover crop seeds on hand. So this shows some of the prep that we did last year. We received a grant through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to cover the cost of the burn. And they also provided, you can see the machinery, they provided a contractor to help clear some of the field edges. The field edges were filled with invasives and also many, many layers of barbed wire fencing from when it was used as a sheep pasture, which really makes the clearing and keeping it free of invasives very difficult. So we did have some help with that. And then in the bottom, oh, I'm sorry if you don't mind going back. That's okay. In the bottom, we had the town conservation staff also came out to help us, and we had summer interns. So it was really a big project last year getting it ready. The left side, Jane Layton and myself were limbing up some of our cedar trees so that they wouldn't be damaged in the burn. And the nice thing about doing all this prep work last year is that there is much less work that has to be done this year to get it ready. But still there is always obviously ongoing maintenance that's required. And so, sorry, you can go to the next slide. So these are action shots from our day of the prescribed burn last year. You can see the burn crew, and then we had some aerial photos. So it was a pretty big day, but it was all done in one day, and it looks very dramatic. The fire and the smoke did not actually, if you were there, it didn't seem as dramatic as these pictures show. And we have 7 bluebird boxes in Chapman and a very dedicated volunteer, Patty, who monitors the boxes for activity. She went out to check on the bluebird chicks in the morning before the burn and after. For us, one of the benefits of conducting the burn earlier in the spring this year is that the bluebirds haven't yet nested and laid eggs, so there should be less disruption to them. And on the right, I was walking the field after the fire passed through with one of the neighbors who abuts the field and who was instrumental in allowing us access to the field and a staging area. While we own most of the surrounding land, there are very few ways to access the field with a vehicle. So having good relationships with the neighbors has been critical. A few weeks later, we planted willows, and you can see some happy pollinators visiting. It really was pretty incredible how quickly we had some beneficial plants move in, and we're hoping that by performing a second burn this year and more seeding, we did not actually seed with anything last year. So this will be our first year of sowing a wildflower mix in the fall. Oh, and we planted 35 willows throughout the field.
I just wanted to quickly, I know we're coming up on our time, quickly share a few examples of how we are expanding beyond the Pollinator Action Plan. We like to lead by example. So our sister organization, RLF, who owns and operates the mall at Lincoln Station, has all this land. It's highly visible along Lincoln Road, and we identified a little neglected patch of grass right at the property edge. It's bordered by a fence and a sidewalk. And we decided this would be a great place to start adding in some of the plants that we were already purchasing for the case study at the toolkit site. So in spring 2020, we broke ground there and planted about 25 shrubs, including 2 species of roses, white meadowsweet and northern bush honeysuckle. And then you can see here in 2021, we continued to expand the site. We added about 10 additional shrubs and 130 perennial plugs, including showy goldenrod, purple giant hyssop, and scarlet bee balm, And you can see here on our right, one of our summer interns is helping to plant. We also that summer recruited a volunteer to stop by once a week and help water and weed and check on the site. And it was just wonderful. Every time we were out there planting or weeding, people walking by from the nearby housing development to the mall would stop and compliment us on how the space has really been beautified. And we also added some plant labels in 2021, and we're hoping soon to add some more permanent signage. So you can see here later that year, the swamp milkweed is blooming and the native bergamot in the bottom left is starting to flourish. And this is also from September of that year. And you can see the blue stem goldenrod really starting to get established there. And then Sarah's going to share a little bit more about some of the additional sites that we've added.
Thanks. I'll be quick, but as we've said, one of our goals, in addition to just enhancing the mix of pollinator plants throughout Lincoln, is also to create more visibility and provide some demonstration areas for residents and anyone visiting our town. So we had 2 areas that we just planted in the spring of 2021. And this is a traffic island at the intersection of Codman Road and Route 126. And it is surrounded by some lush farmland. So this was a process because it was not land that we own. And it was also, because it's a traffic island, we needed permission from our Department of Public Works. So they granted it, but we also needed to be very careful about the plants that we put in, because we couldn't let anything grow too tall and then become, make things difficult in terms of traffic visibility. So Jane Gruber-Chevalier helped us design a plan. And then we had a great group of volunteers who came out that morning to help us plant. And then Bryn set up a sign up genius for volunteers to take turns weeding and watering. We set up rain barrels across the street that we would occasionally drive over and fill up, but that gave our volunteers ready access to water. And then the other area that we planted is called Harrington, and it is at one of our popular trailheads. And it's on a road that's pretty visible. It's at the side of the parking lot. So there really wasn't anything already there. It was just pretty shrubby and just nothing of note there. And so we had volunteers come out. We prepped the site in advance by clearing the vegetation and putting some cardboard over it to try to kill the grass. And then we had another day of planting. And then Bryn again had volunteers sign up to help maintain that over the first growing season. And for both of these areas, we do plan every year for the next few years to, put in a few more plants, make sure that the mix of plants is still beneficial.
Thanks, Sarah. Just briefly want a final thought. I hope this gave you a sense of how the action plan is being implemented and how it's guiding us as we expand Lincoln's pollinator pathway to roadsides and other public and private spaces throughout Lincoln. It's really been heartwarming to see the response from the community and see the plants that we've added leaf out, bloom, and begin to attract pollinators. I just last minute threw in these 2 willow pictures because Sarah and I were out at Chapman Pasture yesterday to do some site prep, and we saw these willows that we planted last fall are really happy and settling in and starting to leaf out already. We did mention, a lot of specifics, but if you need more details about planting lists or site prep, we're always happy to answer questions, and feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryn, Sarah, Evan, and Rob. That was great, and it's just really exciting to see how sort of all of your work kind of fits together and has resulted in just some really amazing on the ground deliverables. It's really exciting. There are a number of questions that have come in. I know we're a little short on time, but I'm going to try and get to every question that folks have asked so far. Russ, hi Russ. Russ asked a question earlier in the talk about the prunella. I understand that there are two subspecies, one native and one non-native. Do we know if these are equally valuable to the at-risk pollinator species? And is it important to plant, just the native versus the non-native subspecies? I know it might be a question for Evan or Rob.
Yeah, so good question. We know the natives work, so you can't go wrong there. In terms of the non-native, there's a chance that they won't work as well. Certainly, with cultivars, we see there's a chance they're not going to work as well. So I think, when you study this, I think we've had this discussion before, you really have to look at every aspect. It isn't just the animals that are doing the pollinating, it's the animals that are using that plant as a resource as well. And, I think at this point, it's best to just go with the native.
And it's easy to distinguish. It's easy to distinguish the two when you're purchasing seed. So
you need to ask them if it's lanceolata, and so we've been able to find sources of lanceolata. So there is some trust there with the nursery, and I know I've been burned with cultivars or nativars or whatever you want to call them. People saying that it was a straight when it clearly was not. So you just need to ask and hope that they're giving you the correct information.
Indeed. There's also a question about providing the right species of, so this is a question about needing to provide habitat. I think this was also Russ. So we're encouraging folks to plant the right plants, but obviously there's also a need for bees and butterflies to have habitat. Evan, I know you mentioned that that's sort of integrated into the plan. Was this also being incorporated into the outreach that was being done with homeowners?
You mean like as far as landscape recommendations for other things you can do besides planting?
Yes, so ways of generating like overwintering habitat. And
yeah, we have, I only showed 20 pages from the plan. If you just download the plan, which is in the chat, I have like a best management practices section at the end, which talks about overwintering habitat, like refraining from raking leaves until springtime temperatures are warmer, all that stuff. It's all in there. Like we sort of parse it out so that it's not repeated throughout the plan on every design. So I separated out the land, sort of like the general recommendations were at the end, and just kept each toolkit to the actual site and its own design. And it's mowing and stuff.
And I'd just like to add that, I didn't have a lot of time, but a lot goes into my recommendation in that I'm looking at the host plants. They're just as valuable as the nectar plants. I'm looking at when those species of conservation concern are actually in flight. Are they spring? Are they late summer? And, a lot of this too is we just don't have data at the species level, the data that we need. So yeah, leaving bare patches for ground nesting bees is great, but each species has a different preference for where they want to nest. And we just don't know the answer to a lot of those questions. And the other thing I want to say is that it doesn't stop with the animal that's doing the pollinating, right? So if you deadhead, you're removing a resource that's feeding native wildlife. And so it's all of that goes together. Remember, we're supporting systems, we're supporting ecosystems and biodiversity at every level. And it's not just about feeding animals, it's conserving their functional role as pollinators and the important ecological role that plays.
Yeah, I'll just put into the screen just to encourage you guys to download the plan, which is obviously free. We have this in the plan, this page, best management practices, and it says right here, be messy. Number 4, skip the fall cleanup, allowing dead stems, leaves, and seed heads to stand over winter, and wait until evening temperatures consistently reach 50 degrees before raking in the spring. Don't be overzealous when it comes to tidying up. And it talks about some weeds, serving as host plants, even though they're not per se the target species for the project, like things like lamb's quarters and Queen's Anne's lace. I mean, if you have them, you might as well you know, if you can refrain from mowing them, you're going to just contribute overall. So I gave those examples, and some of that was taken from the Massachusetts Butterfly Club has published some documents that I drew from for that, as well as Dr. Gegear and other sources. I mean, we pull from all kinds of sources. Like we have, you know, we have mowing guidelines for lawns, you know, there's all kinds of stuff you can do. And if you go to landscapeinteractions.com/services, you can download 4 or 5 other plans that we've done for other communities across Southern and Central New England. And each one has a different mix of recommendations, depending upon what the site was like and what they're doing with it.
Excellent. Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Rob. I think a really good question. I see there's also a hand up, and I will get to you. A really good question came in because there's also a question that I had, and it's about resources. So Stephen asks, how does Lincoln Land Conservation Trust balance stewardship needs? These projects are wonderful, I agree, but I worry that most land trusts don't have the resources to manage areas as intensively as these more garden-like habitats. Do you have a lot of volunteer labor? How do these projects get done?
I guess I'll answer that. It is a huge challenge. And I would say that is the biggest reason why we weren't able to implement all of Evan's toolkit plans immediately in 2020. In terms of, you know, having the money to purchase the plants and also enough staff time, we just don't have that. So we have been trying to do it as strategically as possible. So we do have enough funding to hire 2 summer interns. We actually share them with our town conservation department. So we get them 2 full days a week for about 10 weeks. So that is one part that really helps us because we just have the added manpower. I will say also, in terms of our organization staffing structure, we have our executive director who works full-time. Bryn is on the outreach side, she's part-time. I am part-time, but we also have another stewardship staff member who is also part-time. So, you know, we do invest in the stewardship side as much as we can. We also have volunteers. Like I mentioned, you know, Bryn has started the Sign Up Genius, using the Sign Up Genius website to have organized volunteers. But I will say that it's pretty challenging, especially over the summer, especially to have a regular crew who can come out. Everyone seems to go away on vacation at different times. You know, watering. Last year we were lucky and we did have enough rain through most of the summer, but you know, that's never guaranteed. So I'll just say that's a really long-winded way of saying that we just try to balance it all out. We do work closely in, you know, getting recommendations from Evan. For instance, the seed mix for Chapman is extremely expensive, but it's important to seed the area thoroughly and not skimp on that. So we are investing in that, even though, you know, it's a little bit of a stretch. So, you know, we just have to pick and choose and prioritize where we focus every year.
You know, one thing I could say is that, you know, a lot also depends upon, you know, what happens on the ground. You know, you make these plans and then things change. Like we didn't expect there to be a second burn, but how great is it that the land trust is getting support to do a second burn? I mean, that's amazing. They're going to have such much better results. So, you know, I recommended the seed drill for the implementation, and it seems like there's a partnership opportunity there with Mass Audubon. But, you know, like I can just give the example. I had another site where we were going to use a seed spreader, a native seed spreader, which is made by the same company that makes the seed drill, Truax. And I was just having so much trouble getting it to work correctly for whatever reason, that I just ended up doing it by hand. And it was fine, you know, and I'll talk to you guys about that. You know, you'll let me know, I'm sure, if things pop up. But like, so I just got, you can get something called parboiled rice hulls, which is PBH is like the industry term. They sell them for greenhouses, like they use them as a planting medium to make well-draining potting soil. And it's about, you know, $50 for like a bag that will easily do 4 acres. And you mix, what I ended up doing was I took a 5-gallon bucket, I filled it with these rice hulls. It's like the outside of the rice, so it doesn't have anything edible, so the animals don't eat it. And I mixed that with the seed mixes. And then I just distributed that evenly across the landscape. So you can basically seed 4, 5, 10 acres by hand over the course of 1 or 2 days for the cost of the seeds plus maybe $100 and just a few people running around with buckets. So, you know, there's ways to like save money. You know, you don't necessarily have to have like this expensive equipment all the time. But I think with their case, you know, they've got this opportunity to use the seed drill that Mass Audubon has, which happens to be based in Lincoln. And I would do that for their site if possible, because they have these non-native grasses, which are so dominant. And, you know, getting the seeds to really get a little bit into the ground is so useful for that. So I think watering, you know, to me seems like such a challenge for Lincoln. And I feel for them with that. But I think that they're really moving in the right direction with the shed, with the rain barrels and the solar powered pump. You know, like those sorts of things, you know, you have to kind of do a cost estimate. Do I want to pay people for the next 5 years to do this? Or do I want to just put in something that will do it for me? Or a combination.
And I'd like to add that, you know, if you have 40 acres, you don't need to modify 40 acres to make a difference, right? So I have sites that are that size, 1/4 of an acre is making a difference and expanding, and then managing the native plants that you have that are of high conservation value on the land. So that, you know, through strategy, you can minimize effort and maximize outcome.
Absolutely. We are coming up on 10:20, and I know the next session starts at 10:25, so I do want to end kind of promptly here, but I know, Daniel, you've had your hand up, so I want to let you ask your question, and then Evan, maybe you can address Joan's question in the chat, and Bryn or Sarah, if you have some thoughts about Jessica's question, perhaps you could answer that in the chat as well. Thank you.
So the question, you want me to answer that for corridors? The question is for corridors.
Could you answer it in the chat?
Oh, in the chat. Okay.
Yes. So I'm gonna let Daniel ask the question. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to say thank you to all the presenters, and it was a wonderful presentation. And it just seems that pollinator gardens and pollinator conservations is an amazing gateway for people to engage with the natural world. And, you know, it seems like an activity that people can, you know, wrap their arms and minds and hearts around, and they gain a better understanding of ecological processes and biodiversity. So I just want to thank you for all the work that you're doing. And I also want to also say, you know, Robert's last comment about supporting systems is really important. And it's not just pollinator conservation, it's bird conservation. And that, you know, it wasn't talked about today, but while we're sleeping at night, there are moths out there nectaring. So there wasn't a lot of discussion about the moth species, but they're out there in amazing numbers. So thanks so much.
Yeah, I'd like to say that we are studying, I have 2 years of data on moth preferences, floral preferences, and I didn't include them here, but those data will be included in future plans as I expand to the moths. So thank you for that comment. And we are getting there. I'd also like to say that we're collecting moth and butterfly interaction data now with our web app, which will be launched within the next month. So if you wanted to help us to collect data on moths and butterflies and their floral use, you know, check it out on the Beecology site in the next month or so.
And just to add on to that very briefly, Rob, Lincoln recently had a presentation about light pollution.
Yeah.
And it really fascinating. And we have a lot of work to do, I think, in that avenue as well, to make sure that our pollinators that we're attracting are able to be safe at night in Lincoln. So if, that's posted on our website, lincolnconservation.org, if you'd like to watch that presentation recording.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. I think that was a very fitting comment to end on. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you to all of our presenters. That was really wonderful. And thank you everyone else for your time and attention today. And please enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.